So, Imagine Me Gone, your latest novel, is perhaps a bit more personal than your previous work. And I thought maybe we could start there and you could talk a little bit about how it overlaps with your life and why you decided to write this novel now.
Sure. So yeah, it is the most personal book that I've written. I think the challenge for me was figuring out a way to use some of the materials that I knew eventually as a writer I was going to have to get to. I think one of the best definitions of art I've ever come across is James Baldwin's, that all art is a kind of confession, more or less oblique, and that the process is, he calls it one of arduous, delicate, disciplined self-exposure. So I knew when I was going to write, when I came to this book, that the time had come to get at a lot of that material. So for instance, in the book, the father commits suicide, and my father killed himself when I was 14. So that is a fact of my own life that is here, and the configuration of the family in terms of brothers and sisters, mother and father, is mine. So the why now was just that sense that I had held at bay for as long as I could, getting at some of the preoccupations, particularly with a certain kind of grief and the half-life of the loss of a parent. And then the dual challenge for me was figuring out a way to use that material and grant myself access to it, but at the same time give myself a kind of permission to liberate myself from the literal facts enough to shape it into a narrative whole, so that because I was writing a novel and not a memoir, and so I needed to unyoke myself from all the biographical facts in order to shape it.
And because mental illness plays such a central role in this novel, can you speak a little bit about how you evoke that on the page? I mean, portions of it feel almost claustrophobic at times because they're so intensely in the mind of two of the characters in particular, the father and the son, Michael.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. I mean, any time that I'm writing a character, I'm always, regardless of what kind of character, I'm trying to get as far into the experience of them in their mind and body as I can. And so the means of doing that for me, sort of sentence to sentence, is to find a particular rhythm of the prose that in some way captures something above and beyond just the facts that are being described. So I think that's one of the reasons that, often we all have this experience of we love a book and we press it on our friends and we say, you got to read this book. And they say, well, what's it about? And you say, 19th century sugarcane plantation or something, and we're like, well, okay, maybe. But you say, but it's the way, no, you have to read it. And what you're telling them is that there's something in the rendering that is communicating more than these facts. And so, to me, I'm always trying to get that particular rhythm, and with these two characters, given, as you say, a kind of claustrophobic internal life that they have, I needed to find very different, but nonetheless musically coherent kind of rhythms to those passages and chapters that would carry people in really through the experience of reading those sentences in that rhythm.
Okay. I want to circle back to music in a minute.
Okay, sure.
But maybe this is a good time to read a brief passage.
Yeah. So I was just going to read just three brief paragraphs to give a sense. These are the first paragraphs from the eldest brother in the family, Michael, who eventually, in a way, becomes the kind of center of gravity of the novel because of his struggles with anxiety and depression. But his form of coping with the world is really through parody. And And I had to find a way to try to communicate that because of the humor that's in that too. So this is just the first chapter, not even a chapter, it's this very brief section that you hear from in the voice of Michael, and he's parodying a form that some of you will no doubt recognize. So this is Michael. Hello, you've reached the voicemail of Dr. Walter Benjamin. I'm currently out of the office. If you're one of my patients, please leave your name, a very brief message, and your telephone number, even if you think I already have it, as it may not be handy. I will return your call as soon as possible. Please note that I am out of the office on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and that any messages left on those days will be returned on the following Monday. If this is an emergency and you've gone on holiday by accident with your younger brother, in the hope that you might finally tear your eyes away from the scenes you have been fixedly contemplating your entire life, but find instead that a storm blowing in from paradise has become caught in your wings, so that all you can see is the wreckage of the past piling up before you, one single catastrophe with no future, then please hang up and contact my answering service. Finally, if this is about a refill for a medication you require in order to survive, and you have some concern that your request may not reach me in time, and it seems likely that the words you are about to speak into this machine will be your last, then please know that you tried very hard indeed, and that you loved your family as deeply as you could.
Thank you.
Yes.
So much of Michael's character is presented through his writing. Can you speak a bit about why you made that choice?
Sure. So, I mean, as you could tell from that passage, he is a very inventive and somewhat frantic character. He's frantically inventive, and very much as a verbal matter, too. And so I knew that in trying to portray that cast of mind, it couldn't just be the dark side. It couldn't just be the unmitigated suffering, because it was also leavened with this sort of absurdism that I had in mind. And so the way in was when I decided on the idea of parody, and that there would be these various forms. And so there's a psych intake, like going to a doctor and filling out a psychiatrist intake form that runs to 40 pages. And there, these letters that he writes back from the ship to his aunt that are kind of fantastical. So I think I needed a way for him to speak to the reader indirectly, so that the readers would pick up on how he is in the world, not just from a more distanced narrative point of view, but from something that felt like it was coming right out of him. And they were also the most enjoyable kind of self-generative chapters to write because of that rhythm and speed.
Can I ask, too, that
Yeah.
It caused me to think back to your first collection of stories, My Father's Business, the short story that's in there,
Yeah.
which is a story presented as a series of transcripts that a patient of a psychiatrist has made all these audio recordings, and then the story is presented that way. Was that sort of a sketch or an early attempt at something like this?
I mean, it's interesting. I suppose it could have been. I mean, I think that story also was an attempt to get at, interior mental life in this indirect way. I think the other thing is that one of the facts of people who interact with the medical world, and particularly, over decades when they're dealing with psychiatric issues, is that there is this disconnect between the formality of the language and categorization that psychiatry and therapy engages in, and then just the mess of lived experience. And that itself can become a frustration over time. And then all these, kind of otherworldly named drugs and, all that stuff. So I wanted to get at some of that experience of a patient going through that, that parodies it, that sort of turns it back on itself in a sense. And I actually did a talk to a room full of psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses at one point, and someone raised their hand afterwards and said, do you have any positive things to say about psychiatrists? Which I do, but just not from this character's point of view.
So speaking of characters' points of view, that
Yeah.
Michael is not the only character. Each of the family members, their points of view are represented as each chapter. They're written from the points of view of each of these characters. Can you talk about why you decided to present the novel that way?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is, they all, as I said, needed a distinct voice to me in order to live as separate characters for the reader. And because a lot of the book is about the family dynamics and how they cope with, particularly with Michael, but also the death of the father, I wanted to get at, and I think I only realized this as I was writing it, the ways in which even in a very loving family, which I think this is, and I sometimes think of it as like a love story about a family, there's the kind of misprism of how you attempt to help people that you love, but that built into that form of trying to help is an attempt to make them into or back into the people that you need them to be, as much as the people they themselves want to become. So there's this complicated mix, even with the best of intentions, of how these difficulties play out in families. And I thought that the only way of really getting at that was to see from each point of view a narrated sense of, this is the help as it's coming at me, and this is the help as I'm, I, the other I, is trying to give it. So it had to have that perspectivalism, I think.
Yeah, and if I may say, I think that's one of the most effective pieces of the book is the family always has a sense of just, if he could have this catharsis, or if we could just find the right medications,
Yes,
and
yes.
Yeah, it's very
Right.
real. So getting back to music, Michael is obsessed with disco and EDM, and so can you speak a little bit about the role of music in the book and what you hope to convey through using music, and what role music plays in your life as a writer too?
Sure. There is a lot of music threaded throughout the book, and I would listen to it often when I was writing, not literally while I was composing, but beforehand and after, and in the days when I was working on those sections. I think it is mainly, it's grounded in Michael, and I think the reason is because he finds, as a character, he finds it to be one of the only potential routes out of the immediacy of his suffering is something as immediate as the affect and power of music, and often at very loud volumes. I think the only references to Chicago in the book are actually to, to house music on the south side of Chicago. There's a sense in which I needed to get the evangelism that he feels towards the music, because he's also someone who's trying to press it on other people. And I think in his first romance, that's the case, where he has this crush on this kind of impossible, person he's never actually going to be able to be with. But he feels that music, if you can, which, he's younger in these sections, I think is common in adolescence, that if music can be agreed on, then you can skip over the business of being individuals and just merge into, the fandom and getting carried away by that kind of music. But, I mean, for me in my own life, I grew up listening to a lot of the music in the book, and it was sort of in the household being played, and so I still think of it as kind of the supreme art. I still think of it as the thing that more quickly and more fully than any other art takes you to somewhere that you aren't.
Do you listen to music while you write?
Not literally as I'm typing, but I listen to this sort of idiosyncratically the same 4 songs every day after I finish writing.
What are they?
I'm not going to
You're not
reveal
gonna-
that fact.
Oh.
But in any case, the stuff in the book I listen to often before, on a given day when I was working on it.
Do you listen to different music depending on what you're writing? Like perhaps when you're writing your political work, is it different than when you write a novel? Or?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I listen to any music when I'm writing politics. I don't know that I do. It maybe is, I'd have to pull out a dirge from somewhere. Yeah.
These days.
Yes, exactly.
So getting back to, you mentioned the language associated with the medical profession, but you wrote earlier this year about you wanted to find intimacy in a culture that has hollowed out the very language we use to describe it, how to capture the experience of grief when our terms for it have been overrun by the commercialization of confession. I thought that was a pretty profound statement. Our language is very sort of turned into public relations speak a lot of times.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, the memory that it brings to mind was when I was living, when I first got out of college, I was living in New York with a roommate from college, and he had a stepmother and a stepsister, younger girl. And they lived in New Mexico, and she was very sort of, did, various New Age things. And she said, it sounds sort of incidental, but he was talking to her on the phone one day, his stepmother, and he asked her, she had mentioned joining a gym. And so he asked her, "Oh, are you still going to the gym?" And she said, "Well, no, I realized that last year I emotionally abandoned my daughter, and so I just decided, I was going to not do the gym so much anymore." In this sort of, and I thought to myself, that's the kind of line that at the end of the 19th century you throw yourself in front of a train. You know what I mean? But here it was just kind of like, a latte and like emotional abandonment. And, I thought, okay, this is like the language is being, taken from us in some sense, or it's being commercialized and turned into the commodification of confession. So to me, the enemy is always cliche whenever I'm writing anything. And in a sense, I feel like it just gets harder and harder, right? Because the commercial production of language is like 24/7 overdrive. I mean, it's like the word artisanal to describe food. I mean, it went from like, I live in Brooklyn, so there's a lot of artisanal food. But like artisanal, and then like, I feel like a year later I was driving along and I saw Tostitos, artisanal. I was like, they were made somewhere by somebody. So there is this way in which the language is getting chewed up. And so the writer's task, I think, is still to refuse to give up on the idea that you're going to use the language to capture something that hasn't quite been captured before.
Well, and it seems like that would be something you'd be concerned with as well, given your strong interest in politics. And I mean, political rhetoric has sort of taken a dive. So you want to speak to that at all? Or?
Sure. Well, no, I mean, I think that language, I mean, this is, we know this historically, but I mean, the denigration of language and the deliberate misuse of it to mean the opposite of what it means is a deeply disturbing thing. And I thought 2 administrations ago we were in trouble on that front. Little did we all know. But I think it's also, I am fascinated by political rhetoric in general because in a way, I think it's actually this is true even of great political rhetoric. So it's not just kind of mendacious or kind of foul political language, but is actually the opposite of writing. I think, of literary writing, which is that it is trying to take things that aren't true and make them so. I mean, Nietzsche said that the great philosophers don't say, thus it is, but thus it shall be. And a good politician is a philosopher, someone who's trying to tell you this is how it's going to be. And so they are using language to create a world that doesn't really exist and maybe not hinged to reality, but that through the utterance will kind of take it there. Whereas I think of literary language's duty to capture what exists. So the opposite of the slogan is the line of poetry, right? The slogan that can be endlessly repeated and rephrased, as opposed to the line of poetry that can't be paraphrased. Those are sort of the two ends of linguistic, the tightness of the relationship between language and its object.
Right. And so we were speaking a bit backstage, and you said one of the things you're particularly interested in the political front is the cultural divide that we have at this moment.
Yeah.
It seems that empathy, which is essentially the work of the novelist, would be essential in trying to cross that cultural divide. Is that at all at play in the work you're doing in the political realm right now?
It is in some of the writing that I'm doing. I'm working on a TV pilot at the moment, so and that has got some stuff to do with the divide that we're living amidst. I mean, I'm very conscious there of cliche too, because the narratives that we're given about that divide are themselves quickly calcified and cliched. And so, we're told that there are people in red states and people in blue states, and it very quickly departs from the task of either the dramatist or the fiction writer to be very particular and nuanced about people's lived experience. But that said, one thing that I try to do as a fiction writer is not kind of lobotomize my characters politically. Like, they do exist in a world where politics happens, where culture's happening, where there are problems in the world. And so that, when I'm thinking about it more consciously, what I want to do is, try to bridge that empathic divide to find out, and I don't think ultimately it's that hard when you see a lot of the culture of, I live in New York City. I live amidst the elites of neoliberal economic, ultra wealth. It's not hard to see why that would be deeply alienating to many, many people. And if you throw on the, purposeful lies and manipulation about the motives and everything behind it, then, in the form of right-wing media, then it's not hard to see that. Yeah.
So taking it back to the book a bit, but still in the vein of empathy, you noted in an essay recently that imagining what it's like to be people other than yourself is part of the work of the novelist. And you concluded the essay by saying that in the case of Imagine Me Gone, in some instances you were imagining what it was like to be the people you have loved, and in ways you've known this has brought you back to your family. So can you speak a little bit about how it brought you back to your family and
Sure.
what might have surprised you about that?
Yeah. I think that thing I referred to a couple of minutes ago about the way the attempts to help people are complicated by what you need that other person to be. That was one of the things. The other is, for instance, like my father, I remember at some point when I was writing the book, calling my sister, and we were talking, and she said, I've just been, my father died a long time ago, but, just saying she would be missing my father, and I thought to myself, I'm not really. And it occurred to me that I was spending every day with him. Do you know what I mean? And I think that in the writing of the book, I really was, it was the most cathartic book that I've ever written, because I think I got to spend time with what I sometimes think of as the imaginary family, because I think we all have, I think of family in these two ways, like that we have the literal family, the people we spend time with and that we know and live with, and then there is the story in our mind of who those people are, their presence in our lives when they're gone, whether they're dead or just not present to us, or they living somewhere else. And that is a powerful story that is repeated in our heads pre-consciously all the time. And I think that that's the realm that fiction's operating in, and that people find so compelling when they read stories about families, is that it's that entry into the mythos. Every family has its own myth structure. The most basic one being, what were the lives of our parents before we were born? It's a myth. You only have a few pieces of information. They're outsized. You're piecing them together. It seems hugely significant. And so I think that's the realm that literature kind of interacts with family, and it's a privilege in some sense to have so much time to do that and shape it. There's also a power in it. You get to rewrite the story.
Right. So just for the audience reference, how long did it take you to write this book? How long were you with those characters?
It was 5 years full time. I don't teach or have another job, so God help me. So it was 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
And can you speak a little bit more about that control offered by writing and sort of helping you to reshape your story? Or
well, I think you always have questions about what might have been, particularly if there's sort of tragedy, and for most people that either just remains a strand of thought, or and may never be articulated at all. It may well remain a entirely unarticulated, even unconscious thought, in which case it can cause a lot of suffering. But as a writer, I get to say, well, what if that did happen? What if this was the case? And not just, on a given day in a given conversation, but embody it, imagine the whole thing through, and in a sense, relive in some way. So that's where, it's inalterably a fiction, not a memoir, because I take these things and then I'm trying to make a whole out of it, which is also about being able to communicate the experience to other people, so that it's not notes that, with initials for my family members, right? It's got to be something that's going to make sense from beginning to end on its own terms. And that was one of the things in writing it that I didn't know at the beginning, because it was a bit like painting a landscape painting with your nose to the canvas, and you can't really see the perspective. You have to step back, and readers help you do that.
may I ask what your family's reaction has been?
Sure. Basically very positive. My mother says that, when there's a writer in the family, there goes the family, but she says it with good humor. She's also my best proofreader, so she's an old school proofreader who finds an error in every book. So I think that helps her because she can approach the manuscript with a pencil. But they've been supportive, and they knew that what I was writing about. And a lot of the events in the book are back in time now. So, no, I feel lucky in that sense. It was not something that I didn't worry. And it's also, basically, I think, loving portraits of the characters. So.
Yeah, the relationship that you evoke among the siblings, I think, is particularly compelling. It's not a relationship that necessarily gets its due in literature, so
Yeah.
can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I think that there are two, when you have a trauma or a traumatic event, in a family, I think they're usually, the two ways things often go. Either it's like splits the atoms apart and people can't really, it breaks the family in some way, or people become welded together. And in our family, it was definitely the latter, in which it was like that's happened, and so now we were sort of forced into a level of closeness that becomes involuntary. And so at one point there's an analogy that one of the characters uses, the sister talking about her younger brother, that they're like people on a desert island, each trying to build boats to get off of it, and they occasionally burn each other's boats. Because if one person gets away, then the other person's going to be left on the island with the family. I think sibling life is so central to who we are, and how we, those of us who have siblings, the competition and the love and the admiration and the desire for the attention of older siblings. And all of that contestation just seems so, and it pulls you back into your younger self like that, so quickly, even as an adult, because those dynamics are kind of ancient.
Yeah. You mentioned your mother does proofreading.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about your overarching writing process and what that looks like?
Sure. It's fairly routinized. Poets maybe can get away with an hour a day, but I tend to write from like 9 to 3 every day. I meditate before I write. And when I'm writing, that's something I'd sort of do that 5 or 6 days a week. And usually what happens is I'm working on a chapter or a story or whatever it is, and it'll run for 6 or 8 weeks, and then I'll kind of step back and kind of have to reorganize myself. But it's pretty much a full-time job, and it's also kind of weighs on you when you're not doing it because it's unfinished. So Philip Roth once was asked, what's your favorite kind of novel? And he said, finished novels, which I completely agree with. It's to live inside of a book for that length of time is also to try to keep the entirety of it in your head over that same period of time, because you're trying to make the whole thing as coherent as possible. And so the unfinished, ship has to be in your mind. And that, I think, is a strain. Short stories, it's much easier. You can keep, it's a couple of months being inside that space.
Yeah. And so you alluded to the work you're doing on the pilot right now. Are you planning another novel, or what's next?
Yeah,
for
no,
you?
I've got pages of a new book, and there's a screen adaptation of some stories from the first book of short stories that I'm collaborating with the director on, and then there's a director who wants to make a film out of this book. But the TV stuff is just out of my own head at the moment. So, yeah.
And we didn't really talk about influences. Do you want to speak to who your literary influences are?
Sure. They're quite different for short stories and for novels. For novels, the books that I fell in love with that made me want to be a writer, really, I think, in college were Faulkner, probably first and foremost, but also Virginia Woolf, Henry James, Kafka, the modernists. And they were all people who found a way, to go back to that point about rhythm and sentences, they're all writers who found a way to get the pathos of their characters down into the diction and grammar of the sentences, so that you were learning about and being taken into their minds via the rhythm of the prose. And so that was always my kind of ideal, is to be able to write with my own rhythm, but a rhythm that was doing that. But for short stories, I really think of it as a different genre. So William Trevor, the Irish short story writer who recently died, sadly, and Joy Williams and Alice Munro, probably those three, in addition to the classics, Chekhov and Joyce, that really I learned the most about the kind of short story that I love.
Are you still writing short stories? Or?
I haven't for a while. It's a very different headspace. And I think at the moment I'm thinking about a shorter novel at the moment, because it's sort of hybrid somewhere between the idea that you could get that sort of, you might be able to imagine in a short novel that someone would read it in a couple of days, and that, or a day or two, and that they would have that sort of single breath sense of the short story. You can get certain lyrical effects in a short story that you just can't in a novel. But the disadvantage is, with a short story, is just the canvas is so much smaller. You just can't. There's all kinds of stuff you can't get in.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit, you mentioned sort of a sentence by sentence. Can you speak to how you shape a sentence? Do you work on a sentence by sentence structure?
Oh, yeah.
It feels that way.
Yeah. No, I sometimes think of, when people ask me what I do, and I say that I'm a writer, what I want to say is, like, I'm a sentence maker. Like that is the job. The job is to write sentences. They happen to add up to books. But yeah, so every day the task is, if it's a short story, I read the whole short story as much as I have. If it's a novel, then I'm reading that chapter usually. And I'm reading along, and the task, once I've finished that, which could be 2 hours of editing, because usually the beginning of the day is editing everything that I wrote the day before and earlier. And then once you are there, you're kind of all the way in, then the next sentence has to have a tight rhythmic relationship to the one that came before it and to the paragraph. And of course, it also has to be continuing the story and have something to do with the narrative, but it just has to have a structure and a sounding that is moving. Somebody once called it, they did an interview with me, called it the oral argument, A-U-R-A-L. But in a sense, I do think of fiction as, this is the sort of lawyer part of me, as like an argument about something, like a convincing people of something. And that's done musically, and so it's composition in that sense to me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You said earlier, I'm not a poet, but you must read poetry?
I read poetry.
Yeah.
I read poetry. I've never been able to write poetry. I wrote one poem, and I realized it was just a sentence with a lot of returns. You know what I mean? I think in sentences. I do. Okay. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're at the part in our program where we are going to take some questions, if I'm not mistaken. So if you'll raise your hand, someone will bring a microphone so that we can hear you better.
I think they're over here.
If you had an unlimited budget for the film, what tunes would you use?
For this one?
Yes.
Well, there's a lot of, that's an easy one to answer, because there's a lot of Donna Summer. There's a lot of disco, there's a lot of electronic music, early house music, New Order, Joy Division, British New Wave. The original cover was just black and white, but this font is the font of New Order's first album. It's dance and electronic music from disco forward. There is, for the father character, probably some Elgar and sort of Anglican church music, but I think that the copyright, we're in the clear on that. So, yes.
I think you said you're a lawyer?
I went to law school. I've never practiced as an attorney.
That's pretty close.
Yeah.
So how do you As you're writing, are there parts of the sort of legal mind or the legal skills that you learned in school that you have to either, do you fight them? Do you incorporate those habits in your work?
Yeah.
The way of looking at things?
Well, I think for a long time I didn't think that going to law school, I went to law school when I was about 26, so I'd been writing before I went. So at the time I got there, I thought to myself, oh, it's just like a different voice, like a different language. I thought it hadn't left that much of an impression, but I think it did in as much as in law school you're being taught to write supposedly impregnable sentences, right? Sentences that one side is going to say it means this, the other side is going to say it means that, but it can't be misinterpreted, which is, of course, impossible. But it does make for a certain kind of stringent, punctilious, lack of risk, in language, which is ultimately anathema for imaginative work, because you need to open up and create the space for resonances other than the literal. I think to some extent I still was able to keep it as a voice. I sometimes think about writing a story in the form of a legal opinion. Just because the judges, it's a great form, right? I mean, it's a great, and a fact section of a brief is a short story, and you can win or lose your case on a good story, right? So, yeah.
So you talked a little bit about when you're writing, there's this kind of like a weight on your shoulders, like you just want to finish the book. It's weighing on your mind.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask what it's like once you finish, a novel and the dust kind of settles. What are you kind of thinking about, and then what do you do?
Well, the line that comes to mind is William Gaddis in the Recognitions says, what is a writer but the shambles that's left over once the work is done? And so, I go to therapy. I try to exercise. There is a hole left there, it's also true that it's very difficult. There's so many different endings. You end a draft, and then it goes to your reader. You send it to readers, and then you work on it again, and then it goes to an editor, and then there are various levels of edits. So it stays in your life in a way for quite a while, even after you've had that first cathartic moment. I think mainly I try to be reading a whole lot. Often when I'm writing fiction, I'm reading less fiction while I'm writing. Over 5 years, of course, I'm reading fiction, and the book that I was reading throughout reading this was Proust, because he plays a role in the book. But I think you're empty, and you have to reinvent. You have to kind of reinvent the motivation to write, because hopefully, I think if you've done it right, you've left everything on the floor. And so it's sort of like the larder is bare, you need ingredients to cook again, and it just takes time to find those, Yeah.
Hi. I had a question. You had referred earlier to some of your non-novel writing, your political writings, other writings. I was wondering, where does one find these?
Oh, sure. This last election, I wrote twice. I wrote for The Guardian about the South Carolina primary, and then, I'm sorry, that was The Guardian. And then in the fall, I wrote a longer piece for The Nation about Trump and the use of shame. My reading of it was basically that the story we were told about the election was that it was all about anger. And it seemed and still seems to me that the underlying dynamic has a lot more to do with shame, that anger is the public face of underlying shame, and that one of his geniuses as a performer is to assuage people's shame by shaming other people, by telling them that you don't have to be shamed because of these other people. I wanted to get at that emotional dynamic. So a lot of what I try to do when I write about politics is to write about what I think of as the kind of cultural and emotional dynamics under, in a longer term frame. So, and other than that, I guess it would just be, I mean, the Financial Times and Der Spiegel and other places, I've written commentary over the various years about politics stuff. Yeah.
So when you have a mentally ill parent, one of the fears is that you are going to suffer from mental illness yourself. And I'm wondering if in the character of Michael, that's a composite for kind of your siblings and maybe your own fears about that.
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's more than composite. I mean, there's a good deal of my brother in the Michael character. So, that's closer to home, temporarily for me. And so I'm sort of, when you're out in the world like this, you figure out lines to draw between being a public person and speaking about things and what you don't. So I've spoken less about my brother, but it's definitely part of the story of the book, and part of his story, is the story of the novel, which is the effects, the legacy effects of mental illness in a family, which are dual because they're both hereditary, in a literal biological sense can be, but then they are also obviously environmental. I mean, you grow up in a household in which there is that kind of radical shift in mood, then your own internal clock and rhythms, mental rhythms are affected by that. So, yeah, that was very much part of what I was working through. Yeah. I think there's a question down here in the front, or two in the front.
Could you maybe talk about the grief process for you and what you felt were some of the more significant steps, if you feel comfortable, that allowed you to write to this, and both what happened on a personal level, and then maybe, if you have time, what would happen on a national and historical level for us to both heal individually and more globally, since we're in charge of this world in too many ways.
Yes, wow, that's a big one. Let me see if I can try to be succinct. I mean, I think time is the, personally, I'm talking now. Well, I'll just say I think time and beauty, that sounds like an odd thing. I mean, I think emotional support and all the things that we would imagine, that I think we know in our hearts and empirically that people need to get over things, to be loved, to be able to love other people. But I also think that beauty, in whatever form it moves you, is a deeply healing thing. And ugliness is the reverse. And I think that whether it's whatever art form or experience in the world, in nature, whatever it is, there is something that reminds you of, I will say it, of transcendence, of something that is larger than yourself, that is accessible to you, that is about communal perception and experience. So, I had the incredible good fortune of spending a lot of time, not long after my father died, in an incredibly beautiful place. And I was incredibly sad, but I will always think of those weeks as a deeply healing thing, because the world was inviting me into it rather than assaulting me in some way. So I think that's like our political discourse is so off into a ditch at this point that like that statement probably, sounds like some kind of Aldous Huxley novel of a solution to our problems. But if it's true, I just feel like I have to say it, right? So like I think, and that begins with the beauty of an individual life, the dignity of an individual life, which makes cruelty and cynicism and manipulation the evils that they are. So, I mean, that may sound like a pointillist solution to the larger problems we face, but if you're asking about grief and emotional realities, then I think you can't dissemble your way out of the truth of those things, that they are emotional and personal, and that the conditions under which we grieve are structured politically. Who's allowed to live in beauty? Who lives in ugliness?
Oh, yes. Hi, you have chosen to express your life experiences and your insights about those, your observations about those in the form of fiction. I wonder if you could step back and out, and could you comment about the alternate options of creative nonfiction and perhaps even memoir, and just any thoughts you might have about possibly, not that you would actually do this, but just your observations about those optional expressional forms.
Sure. I mean, I've certainly written essays that drew on life experience. I guess I think I tend to be somewhat old-fashioned, I think, in the lines between genres. Like, I think of essays as ideas that might be illustrated with experience, but the point is that there's an idea there that you're communicating. And I mean, it used to be that memoirs, I mean, I'm not that old, but I used to think when I grew up, maybe just because of my parents, what they read, but that memoirs were like, if you were 85 and you'd been a diplomat and you'd like traveled the world, and you had memoirs because you'd met significant people and had colorful, but that, of course, those days are gone, and you can write a memoir if you got drunk a lot at college. But I guess I still think that in any of these forms, the task is to write good sentences and to capture something that hasn't been captured before. And there is, I mean, my kind of small c conservatism about form, there are wonderful writers that I love who don't observe that at all. Rebecca Solnit is a great, essay writer, but it's not always just ideas, it's kind of peripatetic. And James Baldwin is probably my favorite writer, and his essays in particular. I'm not really giving a very good answer to this. I'm just sort of, saying that those are genres I definitely respect and think about, but I'm most comfortable being sort of 30 to 40 degrees off of the facts. Yeah.
What are you currently reading?
What am I currently reading is the question. I am currently reading fiction. I'm reading the last installment of Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy. So there's Regeneration, Eye on the Door, and the Ghost Road. And I'd read Regeneration years ago and just never got to the other two. But it's amazing about trauma and war and interior life and all of those things. It's not showy prose at all. It's very kind of understated prose, but very kind of exact and penetrating. So yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. Anyway.
Well, thank you all for
Thank you.
coming. Thank you for
Yes,
coming.
thank you.